And for those of you who stick around for the next session, there's going to be a book launch for the book, and we have copies of the book. I don't know whether we have enough for everyone, but there is going to be a stack of books available, so that's an incentive to stay until the end, and even more of an incentive, there will also be some drinks associated with the next session, which is, of course, an extremely important dimension of this whole effort. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing everyone. I think everybody is well known to everybody in this room. Carlos is going to kick off. Then we're going to have essentially a somewhat different order. I don't know why Carlos wanted to have a different order, but we're going to make you number 2. And then we're going to go down the list. So, Carlos.
Okay, is this on? Yes. Okay, very good. So, it's a pleasure to be here again with ICTSD and the TSDS. I have to tell you, last time we organized a seminar in Nairobi in the TSDS event, we had very few people in the audience. So this time we did 2 things. First, we brought almost all the authors of the book to populate the audience, and we promised to distribute books that Bernard was very nice to bring all the way from Europe, and broke his back walking the calles of Buenos Aires with I don't know how many books. But anyhow, this is a book based on a series of lectures of colleagues that work with me at IMD in a program that I used to teach there on trade negotiations. We launched this book last year at the WTO, but immediately after that, Brexit happens. Immediately after that, Mr. Trump was elected. So we decided just to throw away the old book, and we have this new book. The good news, as you can see, it's entitled The Future of the Global Trade Order. So there is a future. But the bad news is that it actually addressed some of the major systemic points, challenges that at this point in time the global trade order face, and particularly the WTO, the institutions that underpin this global trade order. I'm a great fan of George Miller, a psychologist from Harvard that died a few years ago, and he became very famous because in 1955, it was published in 1956, a paper that is one of the most well-known papers in psychology. It's called The Magic Number Plus or Less 2. Because the message of George Miller in this paper was to point out that our short-term memory, typically we can maintain up to 7 pieces of information. Digits, pieces, words, whatever. Plus 2, very clever people like Alejandro Hara can go up to 9. In my case, just 5. So I have just 5 points to make. The first one is the name of the chapter that I wrote for the 2nd edition, and which is entitled The Threat of Economic Disintegration. The second one is basically what the anti-globalization rhetoric, what are the points that are being made, why they are receiving so much attention, and how this differs in the case of the United States, and what happened, for instance, in the case of the Brexit referendum. And in both cases, these situations have implications for the multilateral trade system. The third point is, what does all of this mean for the WTO? And then I finish with some ideas of areas that require additional attention. And I'm going to be referring to the chapters in the book that address each one of these topics. So, the threat of economic disintegration. One thing that we know from the literature, from history, is that every time that there is a global financial crisis, there are typically 3 types of reactions. First, populist parties and politicians receive lots of attention. There is lots of good papers from political scientists showing, for instance, what has happened in democracies going back to the Great Depression and more recent to the global financial crisis. Typically, populist messages that in a nutshell are simple solutions to very complex problems and typically wrong solutions got lots of attention. And we have seen this, be it Mr. Farage and the Brexit campaign, Mr. Trump, Marine Le Pen, and I could go on and on all over the world in terms of this aspect. A second aspect that we also see consistently once you have a global financial crisis is a significant increase of push for regulatory improvements. So from Basel III, Dodd-Frank in the United States, all over we saw significant new regulatory measures trying to constrain the financial sector. And the third one is the temptation of protectionism. So this is something that most analysts in the context of the global financial crisis, the initial reaction was, well, actually this is not happening this time. And actually the WTO has done good work in documenting that in terms of increasing protectionist measures, things were not as bad as the Great Depression, if we look at this. But as the chapter by Simon Evanet and colleagues from St. Gallen, using data from the Global Trade Alert, and that I recommend for all of you to read, the chapter in the book basically shows that if we take a broader perspective of protectionism in terms of discriminatory actions, for instance, the use of local content requirements, the use of subsidies in financing that only benefit national companies, things like that, we are going to see a picture which is a little bit more complex than, let's say, this one that tends to be very complacent about the trends in protectionism. So this is the point number one that I want to make, and to say that this threat is still with us, and it has become even more dramatic with these two developments that we saw last year. I like very much to think moments that announce the beginning of a new age, and I would characterize the new age that we are living as the age of anxiety, that it's very much driven by technological developments, but it's also very much associated with political developments like Brexit and the election of Mr. Trump. Now, there are two chapters in the book, the one by myself and the other by Craig van Grastek, that go into details in terms of what these elections in terms of policies meant. And the rationale behind them, it's a little bit different. In the case of Mr. Trump, anybody who has a doubt, just look at his presidential inaugural address, where basically he says that protectionism is good for you. So basically the message is that trade is a zero-sum game, and through protection you are going at least to increase the size of the pie of some segments in society. Of course, all of this is wrong, but it's a good message for those who are having access to this size of the pie. In the case of the Brexit referendum was a little bit different. It was much more the debate about national sovereignty and the fact that the European Union, to a certain extent, was limiting the national sovereignty of the UK, and on top of that, a lot of misinformation, like, for instance, how much UK would save in terms of contributions to the European Union, etc. So the European Union as a scapegoat for the problems of the UK. But there is also a hint of protectionism there, particularly because we don't know where this is going. But if we go in the direction of a hard Brexit, with the UK having them to rely on WTO conditions for access to the European market, then inevitably we are going to see a significant increase in terms of the trade barriers that the UK is going to face in some areas, like for instance the auto segment and also the food industry. So that's, as I mentioned, these issues are addressed in 3 chapters in the book by Craig, by myself, and by Miguel Mendonça, particularly with respect to Brexit. The third point, what all of this means, what are the implications for the WTO? So the basic question in my mind, it's not that the WTO has lost its relevance, it will continue to be an important institution, but the reality is that we have to ask ourselves something that people like Gilpin and other scholars in the past have asked. Can a neoliberal trade order survive if the leading countries in the world do not support it? And at this point in time, at least one of the leading countries in the world, actually the one that was behind the architecture of the multilateral trade system in the post-World War II period, is raising a series of questions about the validity of multilateral trade rules and the value of the institution. We can discuss as much this is just a negotiating ploy or it's really an attitude, but I would say that one of the main issues, and this is the fourth point that I would emphasize, what is happening in terms of the dispute settlement body in the WTO, and particularly the appeals body, is something that raises a series of questions in terms of the credibility of the multilateral trade system. And here, for those of you who are following the discussions, the fact that the US is basically blocking 3 seats in appointments for the new judge to the appeal body, no doubt is going to affect the velocity, which never was great, but also the credibility of the system. This connects also to the question, what are the implications in terms of the multiplication of regional trade agreements? The question of the dispute settlement is addressed in the chapter by George Sacerdote, and the question about regional trade agreements, Glenn Bonnekamp has an evaluation of the implications for the multilateral trade system. Overall, the message is a positive one in terms of complementarity, but there are also a series of challenges. So, to finalize, there are several chapters that deal with the issues that a multilateral trade system that works in the 21st century needs to address, be it the question of regulatory cooperation. The best chapter in the book, of course, is from Bernard Hoekman and is exactly on this topic. Then we have also a terrible chapter by Nick on digital economy, but you should read it because it's a whole new world for us to discuss and what it means in terms of the multilateral trade system. And also we have a chapter about the complementarity between competition law and trade law by Eduardo Pérez Mota. Alejandro Hara also discussed the importance of us looking into issues like state-owned enterprise and the rules of the game for these entities in his chapter. And actually he gives us some message of hope. He used history as a mechanism for optimism, reminding us that in 1982 we also had a crisis at the moment that there was a discussion about introducing services negotiations in the context of the multilateral trade system, and that at that point in time, as those of you who were around remember, there was huge opposition from countries like Brazil and India to this proposition. The contracting parties took time out, and 4 years later it was possible to launch the Uruguay round that led to the creation of the WTO. So, if you want to be an optimist, this is something that we can reflect. There may be a message of hope. If you ask me what this book says about the future for trade negotiators, economists, and lawyers that operate in this area, in one word, the word is good. In two words, not good. And, and to finalize, since today is December 12, with respect to the ministerial conference and the outcome of it, I guess the best thing that we can do is to pray for the Virgin of Guadalupe, who today is her day, because other than that, there is no hope. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Carlos. So we have four discussants who I'm sure have all read the book from cover to cover.
Of course.
Of course. Again, as I mentioned, the book will be available at the end of this session. So we'll start with Félix Peña, who is going to kick off the discussions of the book.
I was not able to read the book because I was expecting to receive the book today, so I will hope to receive one book at least later on. But I read an excellent chapter of the book that is about regional trade agreements and the WTO. And I choose this chapter because I had the impression that was in some way related to some of the main issues we are discussing today or we should suppose someone is discussing today in the ministerial conference about the possibility of preserving the multilateral rule-oriented system that was launched when GATT was created, and is yet too soon to see if we'll have some news about the multilateral trade system when the conference is finished. But in any case, I wonder if we'll be talking of a multilateral trade system or the multilateral trade system. Because I have the impression that the main discussion today is if we'll have one multilateral global trade system or we'll have eventually several multilateral global trade systems. We had in some way that were not global, but in some way Europe was global in that moment since 1860 and 1920, 1930 when the system collapsed. And I have the impression that from the beginning of the actual system, the idea was that the principle of non-discrimination should be in some way analyzed, having in mind the possibility of having exceptions to this principle. Exceptions were Article 24 of GATT. When I was a student, I read carefully Article 24. I read everything that has been written about Article 24. And one day, several years after, I read a wonderful article of Professor Kerry Chase about why the idea of free trade area was included in Article 24. And there after that, I began to have a more realistic approach to the rules of the game of the multilateral trade system. Now, that's the reason why I wanted to read as a first chapter of this book the article, the chapter about regional trade agreements and the WTO. And I have the impression that I could make a suggestion with respect to what will be, or I hope will be, the chapter in the third edition of the book. Because this chapter finished with TPP, and in some way also there is a mentioning of the regional comprehensive trade agreement. And I want to make my last remark with respect to what I learned reading the TPP and what I don't know yet, but I will learn reading the regional comprehensive agreement. But in any case, reading the TPP, I arrived personally to the conclusion, I am not willing to that everyone will share my conclusion, that finally the challenge to the global multilateral trade system wasn't only originated in what the government of Donald Trump has raised as element of discussion. You have the challenge included in the TPP, and I will mention this immediately. Why? Because the TPP includes an article difficult to find, very in the last moment of the treaty. There is an article that answers a very, very important question if you have in mind the idea of preserving one multilateral global trade system. That is the idea, original idea of the GATT, and that was included in the WTO. This article is Article 4, Chapter 30, that answers the question of who could be member of the TPP. I thought, reading everything I read for many years, I teach for many years, that in some way, someone that were part of the Pacific region could be member of the TPP. And yes, the answer is yes. The first possibility of being member of TPP is being member of APEC. The second possibility is any country in the world that demands to be member of TPP and that is accepted by the founding members of TPP. I recall the name of one country and I thought, China, for example, was not member of TPP, and if they want to be member of TPP, they must ask to be member of TPP, and they should be accepted by the founding countries according to their own rules. That means should be approved, for example, by the parliament of some of the big countries, members of the TPP. Well, President Trump withdrew United States from the TPP. It's difficult to know how will be redraft TPP in this final version, but here is where I come to the Regional Comprehensive Agreement. I didn't read the Regional Comprehensive Agreement. I don't know if there is a text that has been published. According to the president of the TPP, I must assume that perhaps they do exactly the same thing that has been done by the TPP, that is, I could access to the text when it was signed by the countries, and it was already closed, the discussion. Why I raise this? Because if TPP was drafted with the capacity to fragment the global multilateral trade system, a kind of WTO plus multilateral trade agreement, the question would be, well, what will happen if now also the Regional Comprehensive Agreement includes an article similar to that was included in the TPP? That means that eventually Argentina or Bolivia or any country in the world could be member of the Regional Comprehensive Agreement. We could be member of the TPP. We could be member of the Regional Comprehensive Agreement. That means that in very few years we'll have a kind of fragmentation we had before the First War as a result of the multiplication of bilateral trade agreements. I mention this because I think this is one of the more relevant issues we have in the discussion about how to strengthen the multilateral global trade system as the only system related with trade governance. Thanks.
Thank you. So that actually is a good segue into our next speaker, Andreas Esche, who is the director of the Bertelsmann Foundation, working on economic issues, including trade. And of course, if we think about the TPP and the prospect of potentially accessing to the TPP, or what is now the CPTPP, which is quite a mouthful, of course we also have the European model, where we have the European Union, but also we have Europe actually negotiating trade agreements, certainly with the neighborhood. So there you have a different block with a different set of rules as well. So, Andreas.
Thank you, Bernard. That works now. Great. Yeah, thank you for having me here. And in fact, when TTIP was mentioned, we were kind of electrified as a foundation, and with a project called Global Economic Dynamics. That kind of was like a focus of our work, and we just immediately hopped on the TTIP endeavor, and we started with the first study in June 2013, when actually the negotiations started, and the simple title was "Who Benefits from a Transatlantic Trade Deal?" And we tried to kind of give a full picture of really who benefits and which third parties might lose due to trade diversion effects or other things. Not so surprisingly, the result was basically that everybody, in the end, almost everybody was benefiting. There were few countries who lost, but really kind of almost non-significantly. And immediately after we published that story, a storm broke loose. So we had a multimedia, social media, whatever storm shitting at us. Sorry for the shitstorm word. We never experienced so far, and we kind of often went into the political arena and were used to be hit, but this was new. Okay, then we tried to kind of open this up, and we did another story, another study on how might TTIP affect less developed countries. And we said, okay, there are going to be problems, and they have to tackle these, and they might be solved in this or that way, but still, from a macroeconomic global perspective, this thing is still beneficial. Not automatic for everyone, so one has to do something, but it can be done. You know about the way how things moved. I mean, we did not succeed. We lost. We saying us as representative for those who were in favor of TTIP at that time. We lost in full scale. We had a situation. And meanwhile, when journalists asked us, could you tell us someone who might take a word in favor of TTIP in Germany, and because we can't find one. It was in a situation where nobody kind of really wanted to come. So how we tried then finally to come up with some or paper with 5 steps to make TTIP more inclusive, and I think that I still think they were good ideas, like open it up for third parties, to strengthen the role of WTO in this whole thing, reduce or abandon complex rules of origin, and a number of other things. It didn't help. We lost the battle. So you said 5 is the maximum. I try to do it in 5 points. Why I think we and I don't mean the Bertelsmann Stiftung, but rather the case of TTIP was lost. First is, I think, when TTIP negotiations started, this was basically right after 2008-9 economic crisis and European debt crisis. So the trust into what politicians did and decided and how they did it was almost kind of reduced down to a minimum. And related also to 2008-9 crisis, trust in what the Americans do and how beneficial that's going to be was really, really deep and low. So there was probably not enough political capital for kind of maintaining this apparently friendly or business-friendly transatlantic project. Second, we were used that trade was a non-issue. You could negotiate trade deals without any kind of public attention. That changed. That changed probably due to the fact that this was not trade anymore in a classical sense. It was deeply kind of rooted into what people's lives or matters for people's lives. This was consumer protection. This was the way how we treat chickens. And that was probably the most powerful picture used by the anti-TTIP campaigners, is the chlorine chicken. If you ask somebody that thing doesn't taste less good, or it's more unhealthy, but it's a picture that people in Germany at least really kind of embraced and which brought them, or raised their emotions. TTIP was in this case different. Third, I think it was starting around that time, the starting of a new way of public dispute. So we never, I mean, campaigns like from attackers who have been there, but the use of social media as a tool, at least for Germany, I would say, reached new heights. And this is, for me, one of the reasons which explains how it was possible after 1983, where the Americans or American mid-sized nuclear rockets were stationed in Germany. This was the second time since that more than 500,000 people went on a rally in Berlin for a topic on trade. I mean, who could have expected that? So it was vastly underestimated the thrust and the pinpoint of this public campaigning, and I think it's still interesting to kind of get a bit better look at who is campaigning there and who is behind these very, very well organized moves. Fourth, it just didn't only hit us hard, it's also hit the political caste. I think they weren't prepared either to cope with this and cope with these new conditions. If we look at European Commission, at that time your Commissioner de Gucht was somebody who kind of really didn't care too much about the way how this showed in public. Said the public has basically to be quiet and to take what we're doing here because we have the mandate. And public didn't behave. So they said at a certain point, we don't see it this way. Yes, someone gave you the mandate but that was maybe only about trade. It wasn't about kind of changing our lives. So this was not prepared from the Commission side, but it was also not, if I look at the German government, there was no real kind of advocacy within the government as kind of broad-shouldered support for TTIP. The only one who kind of really had to fight in his own party was at that time German Minister of Economic Affairs, who really had a hard job to convince his own party. But apart from that, you really didn't hear strong voices in favor of TTIP. I think also due to the fact that this kind of anti-movement was so efficient. And fifth, and maybe last, and that also goes back to the way how we treated the issue. We try to sell something which is not, at least not purely, but mostly not economical, with purely economical reasoning. And I think we kind of helped everybody who posed this, and to show that how far from reality we were with that. I think it takes, this is a social political challenge. It has to be dealt with accordingly. That is at least a lesson we learned, and I hope we do it better next time. However, we now look at TTIP, but we wouldn't try to do it the same way we did.
Okay, thanks. So I think we have the regional agenda and lessons from experience, and we can come back to that in the question and answer session. But clearly, the world has changed, not just in terms of the economic fundamentals, but also in terms of the engagement in this process. So our next speaker is Diana Tussie, who is from Buenos Aires.
Yes, and the WTO has come to town, so thank you. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and as I say, the WTO has come to town, and my friends have come to town. So I should be celebrating, but I also celebrate the book. I did read the book, and not only thank yous, but also congratulations. I think the book has 3 messages, put very succinctly. One is that there's a real threat of disintegration in the system. The second message is that we need to move away from, or the system needs to move away from business as usual. The third message is that we need to highlight the incentives for multilateral cooperation. So for me, those are the 3 messages. And I agree with 2 and 3. I agree that we need to move away from analyzing the WTO in the way we have been analyzing it, and that we have to highlight that multilateral cooperation is a value in itself, and that is very good, and I agree with that. I don't agree that much, and this is, I'm going to put it on the table very bluntly, is that the system is in the threat of disintegration. For one, the system has been under the threat of disintegration for over 30 years, and we've always seen it being saved. The 1970s was the new international economic order, and UNCTAD was created, and then the GATT flourished all the same. Then we had the Tokyo round was not about to close, and then it did close with the, what was it called, the menus or the different, what were they called, I forget. But anyway, the menu approach to the round. Then we had the Uruguay round, and we had the Europeans saying, bringing in non-trade concerns, and we were about to commit suicide, and the Uruguay round closed. So maybe this is more, I mean, I'm not saying that we have more of the same. I think we are at a different juncture, but it's, I don't see it disintegrating. And I'll tell you why I don't see it disintegrating. For one, I think that I'm not nostalgic. I'm not nostalgic for the world that has changed, that is changing, or the world that we have lost. I'm not nostalgic. There is something of that old boys network that is changing. I was never part of that old boys network, as you probably know, and as you can probably see. And I've always been in favor of change, so I'm not nostalgic. I'm not nostalgic for the times when Britannia ruled the waves. No, sir. Second, I think, and I'm being unfair now, but I want to put it bluntly. I'm being unfair with the book, I mean. The book is more cautious than what I'm going to say now. There's a danger of identifying the WTO with the DDA, with the Doha Development Agenda. And I think it's true that the Doha Development Agenda casts a long shadow on the WTO. That's true. But there is a danger of over-identifying the WTO with the DDA and with the negotiating functions. And I think this is what we need to do. I mean, look away and open our eyes. There are other functions in the WTO, as you all well know, but we don't bring them into the fore so strongly. These are the issues that don't hit the headlines. These issues do not make for messy ministerials, where there's so much flaunting and parading, and I have to say this, and we have to say that, and so needs to say that, and Mr. Trump needs to be heard. Well, it's not Mr. Trump, but the USTR needs to be heard, and etc. I mean, there's so much flaunting and parading in these ministerials, but there's still, and there's a lot, of course, I mean, civil society complaining, and we have cities being taken, and noisy marches, etc. All this, of course, hits the headlines. But the problem is misidentifying then the negotiating function, and especially the DDA, with all the other functions of the WTO. Fostering transparency, monitoring compliance, implementation, dispute settlement. Of course, dispute settlement is under risk at the moment, these very days, from what we're hearing. Yesterday, as a matter of fact. But, I mean, maybe there will be some adaptation there, and I would pick up the chapter by Miguel Rodriguez Mendoza on the adaptability crisis of the WTO, and I think there I would agree fully. There's an adaptation crisis, but we all go through adaptation crisis. We all have our growth crisis every decade. No, every decade we celebrate, and I'm into my 50s, I'm into my 60s. Well, and we celebrate or have some growth crisis going on. I mean, the system is the same. I mean, it has to adapt. Of course, there is system maintenance, and that I don't see it in crisis. And at the same time, of course, there's system progress and system advancing. That is not happening. That's where I find, I mean, Miguel Rodriguez Mendoza's chapter, I mean, the cautious words or the cautious look on the system that I would agree with. Yes, there's an adaptation crisis, and I think system progress is frozen and will be frozen for a while until the ground for adaptation is solidified, until we find the ground for adaptation. And of course, China. I mean, this is what Félix was saying. China is accepted, and is accepted from a rule, as it moves from a rule taker to a rule shaker to a rule maker. And that is a big change. I mean, it's not a small change. It's not equivalent to the non-trade concerns of the European Union in the 1990s. It's, of course, a much bigger adaptation crisis. But I think, again, to support my claim that the WTO is capable of adapting, we've always had, again, these geopolitical sort of struggles, or the geopolitical shadow on the WTO, or on the GATT, and the WTO has always been there. I mean, after all, the GATT is a Cold War creation, and it is a geopolitical creation. I mean, it is part of the two systems that were born out of the Cold War, the capitalist system and the communist system. We only had, if I recall, 5 countries that were communist, that were member of the GATT. Hungary maybe, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Cuba. I think those were the countries. Am I right? I don't remember that. Then we had the fall of the Berlin Wall. Again, a geopolitical, well, not crisis, it was almost an emancipatory time. And again, the WTO adapted. We had all the countries, I mean, almost a rush of accession, and the WTO adapted to that as well. Of course, the countries adapted to the WTO more than the WTO adapted to the countries, but it was a big change for the WTO. And of course, now we have the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Yes, I think we are hostage in a way to the DDA. We are hostage to the negotiating function of the WTO, of the WTO. And there's no smooth way of moving ahead. That I would agree with the book's message. There's no smooth way to move ahead at the moment. We've seen TISA moved out, or sort of siloed out of the WTO. It also doesn't move. So if you move within the WTO, the DDA doesn't move. Without the WTO, TISA doesn't move. So the negotiating function, yes, I agree, will need to be, is in a hiatus, is going to be going through an adaptability crisis. But to close, I think we have to come to terms with that. We have to come to terms with the new world that's coming about. And I think it's very useful to think of the system, of the value of the system as system maintenance, not as a problem, but as a very important value that is still there, and it is not in crisis. The system, of course, will be different. But I'm not nostalgic for the old times. I'm not nostalgic for the elitist times, for the old boys network. We're all boys here, actually, except me. So I'm not nostalgic for the times that we have lost. I look forward in the sense, I mean, there's going to be crisis. There's going to be sort of a harrowing, and sort of we're going to kill each other over non-trade concerns. We did, of course, but we have to adapt, and that's part of the message that I want to share with you, and which in a way I think the book does share much more strongly than the introductory chapter does. The book is in a way much more cautious than the introductory chapter. Thank you very much. It's a fantastic book.
Good. Thanks a lot for that. Especially the positive message there. And Doug is going to continue to be very positive. Right? So our last speaker, Doug Lippoldt.
Okay. Well, thanks. I'm very, very glad to have a chance to weigh in then at this point in the discussion. I have to say this book is immense. There is a wealth of empirical information in here that has been amassed, and I haven't given it its full due in wading through it, but it's what I've read is just extremely useful in its calm empirical stock taking, especially as you say in the back chapters. So I guess you know, I don't think, I hear this refrain a lot when I talk to clients these days, that, you know, this doesn't seem like a normal time. You know, and I hear in the past, historically, in my experience, the corporate clients were always marginally interested in trade because it affects the ability to do business. The financial institutions usually, our institutional clients usually with a step back because they're more interested in the macro factors. Now, across the board, the level of uncertainties risen, the faith in international institutions is weakened, and I think I'm hearing from clients across the board expressions of concern. And to me, I take this very, very seriously. If we can't, if businesses are starting to realize that they can't take international institutions for granted, you know, whether it's the WTO or NAFTA or the European Union, these institutions help to provide a sense of the direction of travel, that is, toward further integration, further market openness. And if they're weakened, people aren't certain about what the next steps will be. This uncertainty is costly. I mean, from a business perspective, if the conditions to trade and invest going forward can't be assessed clearly, then creditors start to demand a risk premium, a larger risk premium than normal. There was an interesting study I saw by the Confederation of British Industry and PwC in the lead-up to the Brexit vote. And they did some modeling exercise looking at Brexit scenarios, and they found that if investing, if they're not sure of the terms and conditions that they're going to be facing going forward. The advanced economies. You know, what I'm concerned about is I think there's a wrong assignment of blame in many cases for the development of this tension around these points, where trade is being blamed. Sometimes import competition is associated with these problems, but more often than not, it's technology. There's technological change that's driving this dislocation. Anyhow, I think Craig von Grastek's chapter does an excellent sort of stock-taking of this grim picture, and it left me more or less crying in my beer last night as I was reading through it again. And you know, as he says, workers have fewer options than firms, you know, to shift business. So and then if you come on to Carlos's chapter and you see this, the threat of economic disintegration, these are strong terms, strong language. And in my own work, I've been assessing risk looking into 2018. I'm having to write about the threat of trade disruption. So. And what's interesting is when you look back, I was looking back through G20 declarations, as one does, and if you look back to the Montreal Consensus in the year 2000, it's pretty interesting. This G20 declaration was talking about affirming globalization, but talking about the importance of engaging emerging markets, about having social safety nets that are viable, about having inclusive growth. It's interesting that policymakers actually saw, you know, looked ahead and saw these areas for action and then failed to act as the train wreck unfolded in slow motion before our eyes. So we actually knew beforehand that some of these issues needed to be addressed. So now we have institutions that are being impaired by blockages, even threats of rupture in the case of NAFTA. We've got, as Carlos alluded to, the appellate appointments blocked in WTO. We've got systemic change coming in the UK. So I was very glad to see in the mid and later parts of the book some discussion of constructive steps that could be taken to reinforce the institutions of international trade. I appreciated Bernard's chapter, the discussion of the need to take into account trade implications of regulatory policy formation. Nick's point about the need to bring into the internet era the half of humanity that's not had an opportunity yet to engage, or if we have Ambassador Peres-Moto's discussion of the need to bring competition policy into trade so we have a more integrated approach. I think this is, you know, healthy. It's quite needed, and this institutional strengthening that these chapters might help to catalyze is really important, because I think we're going to be facing in the coming decade another sort of future shock. You know, when I talk to my colleagues in global research at HSBC that are working on specific sectors and specific technologies, they're raising eyebrows. They look out at things like self-driving vehicles, and they see, if you look at self-driving vehicles, that's an interesting case. In the U.S., truck driving provides access to middle-class jobs for workers that may only have secondary school completions. It's something like 4% of the U.S. labor force is somehow involved in this trucking sector and related driving activities and maintenance activities, etc. What happens if you have self-driving trucks? If this avenue into the middle class for people with less than university education is constrained? We have artificial intelligence coming. You know, I think what I'm saying is that there's technological disruption, and we need healthy institutions governing international trade if we're going to have the kind of resilience we need in the global trading system to survive. And it's one of the reasons I was so upset to read the summary or the reports on Alan Wolf's, the Deputy Director General's, statements in a private capacity, I should stress, at American University back in October, you know, where he's saying the system with the U.S., how did he put it? The U.S. is absent for this one, I think he said. With the U.S. no longer serving as a sort of guarantor in the multilateral system, we need to find another way forward. We need to have an anchor in the system. And it may be that TPP provides a core of countries that have a shared vision of how the system might advance. Maybe that can be brought in and adapted. I don't know. It may not be a threat. Maybe it's a catalyst for reform within the WTO. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's greater use of plurilateral agreements. Maybe it's multilateralizing regional trade agreements. I'm looking at my OECD colleague, Isa here, who has written about that. The point is, we need to get back to a position where the multilateral trading system is offering win-win propositions, offering value propositions that encourage people to re-engage, that help to clarify some of the challenges and to address the concerns that we're seeing in the legitimate areas of labor market dislocation that are maybe associated with trade, where that is the case and it's not something else driving it. But it also means we need to have a more coherent approach as well to deal with the non-trade aspects that are causing the trade system to be disrupted politically. And I think with that, I'll leave it. And thanks very much for a great volume. It's been a good thing to read through. I look forward to using it as a reference going forward.
Good. Thank you. So, perspectives, we have optimists, we have pessimists, we have people in the middle. So, floor is open for questions, comments, reflections, disagreements.
Bernard.
Yes.
We have several of the authors of the chapters in the room. Alejandro was sleeping most of the panel, but maybe he has something to say, so let's ask if the authors want to contribute.
So do we have a microphone?
And at the same time, to try and give the technology sector people a way into the trade world. And so a big part of the chapter is really designed for people who come from either world and don't know the other, to try and find some common ground. And then after that, I reflected on how you as a policymaker can start to do something of use to your economy. And I guess in the simplest form, UNCTAD's latest statistics suggest that the internet's direct and indirect effects are about $25 trillion GDP per year. Well, that's 1/3 of global GDP. So if that's true, and you're an economic policymaker, and you're not making the digital economy one of your priorities, are you crazy? Because who does that? Who would ignore an opportunity that big? Like, nobody would do that. Well, I think nobody would do that, but maybe somebody does. And so the sort of dichotomy in the debate about the digital economy, because I work most of my time in Geneva with mostly developing countries, helping them actually understand where their national priorities fit into digitalization. Just seeing the gap in what people see the internet as and what it really is, where we believe that 75% of the benefits of digitization actually go to traditional industries, not to internet companies. Yet the debate about the internet as an economic force is almost entirely driven by business to consumer services, which are 10% of services. Business to business services are 90% of the value of digital services. So there's a huge gap in understanding of the impact of technology on the economy and on what parts of the economy. And there's also a huge data problem. We don't know enough, and never have, about services in hard data terms. And yet services are 75% on average of OECD economies and growing. They're a majority overall of the world economy. So we know less and less about more and more of our economic activity, which to me is a little like driving with cataracts that get worse every minute and not stopping the car. How can you make wise economic policy without the data on a majority of your economic activity? Yet we seem to be willing to do this, which is a little weird. And so I try in the chapter really to draw out some of these mutually contradictory situations, but then suggest a few ways in practical terms that the Geneva community in particular could break down some of these things into smaller parts and look at them and bring in other stakeholders, for instance on data protection and the like, to try and take this ocean boiling experience of e-commerce, which is like everything and nothing, and bring it down into smaller parts that could actually be looked at in a concrete way. So we will see what comes out of this, but I think it's pretty clear to me, given the advent of the Friends of E-commerce for Development, and we now have developing economies and even least developed countries making proposals on e-commerce this year, that the fact that so much of the economy is digitized, people are getting the message that they do have to care, and that it is an essential part of their economic planning and their trade planning to start to find ways to capitalize on the opportunity that exists. So I don't know what will happen in this ministerial in terms of formal outcomes, but I suspect strongly that those who are willing will go somewhere after this, that we won't sit for 2 more years and discuss what e-commerce is in informal meetings in Geneva without a chair and without reports and all the rest of it. So that would be
okay.
it.
While I take a picture of Alejandro sleeping, I don't know if Simon and Eduardo want to say anything, and then we open the floor.
No, it's the Simon Evenet back there.
Thanks. I'll just keep this very brief. And my very short summary will turn into a question. So I'll hopefully bridge to the next script. Good. So, in the 1930s, we had a Great Depression, and then there were loads of import restrictions. In the early 1980s, we had a very sharp global economic downturn, and we had export restrictions. Okay? I learned from that several things. First, whenever there's a sharp economic downturn, there are forms of discrimination. The second thing I learned from this is that the form of discrimination changes, which has a big implication, so that when you go looking for the form of discrimination, when a new crisis hits, you shouldn't look for what happened last time, or you shouldn't just do that. You should look to see how policymakers are innovating. The third thing I take from this is, I know I want to agree with Diana here, is that both of those two previous examples showed that the world was able to learn from the mistakes and then build global institutions, better global institutions afterwards. So that does make me a little bit optimistic that we doesn't have to be a bad outcome. So then comes my question to you. Given that we have all sat on commissions to try and save the WTO over the last 10 years, right? And we have all written proposals which have all been ignored. Isn't the real question, what's the trigger for change? What factors would actually trigger a realization by governments that they need to improve this institution, and that the status quo, which is just slowly eroding the credibility of this institution, is unacceptable? So that's the question to the panel. What's the trigger?
Okay, good. So let's... are there any other speakers that want to quickly say something about their chapters, and then we'll go and take questions, comments? Alejandro, you want to come in? No? Okay, so let's then go to the floor. I see a lot of hands, so Simon, why don't you pass the microphone?
Thank you, Bernard. Lippoldt Chatterjee from Kurtz International. Obviously, I have yet to read the book, but I have had the opportunity to look at its content page. And it looks like that it's going to be a great reading. There are so many chapters written by so many experts on contemporary, on important issues. So I'm looking forward to read it. So first of all, congratulations to both the editors and the authors for coming out with hopefully some fresh food for thought in order for the global trade order to see how it's going to evolve over the near future. And I'm sure it's not a question, it's just a suggestion or just a thought. I'm sure that this book is going to be not just a must-read for students of international trade, students like us, but also it's going to be very, very popular among the overall global trade community. So I'm sure that the editors will have much more job to do in the near future. You're going to come out with a second volume, hopefully much larger, with many more chapters. And I hope that in the second volume, there are going to be chapters written by experts from Africa and Asia, which I think is not there. So you cannot see global trade order by not having the thinking, the thoughts of experts from Asia and Africa. So that's a suggestion, not just a thought. Thank you.
Good point. We might do another edition, but it's definitely not going to get bigger. Please.
Okay, yeah, my name is Henry Huiyao Wang from Center for China and Globalization. I think this is really a fascinating discussion, and also the topic of future of global trade order is really in place. But I'm just wondering, and I also want to ask the panelists that now, as we heard also just now, the digital economy, actually China just had the World Internet Conference. I was just coming from there, and China is now one of the largest digital economy. We have 800 million internet users and 700 million digital mobile phone users. So we talk about TPP, we talk about other regional trade agreements, but it seems that even WTO now we had a lot of obstacles or stand still that we haven't really moved much forward. But so when we talk about future global order, do we have to consider that we need a strong leadership? Of course, the existing governance system, but also the new strength that we can gain from the international community. For example, like China, for example. Of course, now we see that U.S. under Donald Trump is withdrawing and back off. But then. When we having the big international trade powers to support any international trade system, then we're not going too much forward. So, for example, China has actually initiated the Belt and Road Initiative. For the last 10 years, China has spent $11 trillion on China infrastructure project. And also, in the future, the digital economy, China would be one of the biggest forces like EWTO or EWTP, like driven by a company like Alibaba and those for So do we have to, do we consider those factors in the future of trade order, or we have to add new momentum, a new element into that? Like Belt and Road Initiative, like the EWTP and or EWTO type of new mechanism to facilitate the digital growth in the future. So that's my question. Thank you.
Good question.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here in the front. So, yeah, this next to Alejandro.
Thank you. Well, I have a comment and a question, and two questions. The first is to all the panel, particularly to Félix, Peña, and the second is to Diana.
Not fair.
Well, trade, no, to all the panel, I said. Okay, Félix. Well, talking about the future of global trade, my comment is I think G20 has an important role to play, although G20 is not a regulatory institution and doesn't make binding rules. I should say before that my name is Beatriz Naufal. I was the former Sherpa of G20 for Argentina under Malcorra's, when Malcorra had the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Argentina. So I think G20 can be a very good forum to work like it does with our multilateral institutions, thinking and having a meaningful dialogue about the future of global trade order. Yesterday, Félix suggested in one of the sessions, Félix Peña, that maybe the G20 countries could ask the think tank, the T20 and the B20, how the global trade order should be reformed, because what we are seeing is a lack of consensus regarding the multilateral global trade order, and the Maelstrom Félix mentioned had asked the United States to say specifically which areas they want to reform. And I basically think there are two areas that claim reform. Nick made a point, yes. One is the digital economy is calling for new rules, and the other is climate change. And we could think about a third area that is not a systemic force, but is a very important force, which is the mistrust in institutions that was mentioned by the HBC chief economist David a moment ago. So I think the G20 could start a meaningful dialogue. Dialogue doesn't mean that we're going to find the solutions and the Argentine presence, but we need to put. From our standpoint, we also think that in terms of trade reform, not only fuel subsidies, not only fisheries subsidies, but agricultural subsidies and agricultural protectionism have to be on the table if we want to deal with climate change and if we want to deal with problems of poverty in Africa, etc. So my question to all the panel is whether you think we can have a meaningful dialogue on these issues in the G20, and what are your concrete suggestions, and specifically to Félix. And then my question to Diana, I thought she was very smart. She's always very smart. She was very smart when she said China went from rule taker to rule shaker, and maybe to rule maker. We don't know yet. But so my question is regarding the rule shaker and whether Trump has any legitimate arguments in that regard, and whether we need more transparency in what kinds of industrial policy are or not admissible in WTO. Because what basically happened when the United States talks about protectionism, at least in G20 meetings, the United States says that protectionism is not only tariffs, protectionism is when a country asks as a counterpart for foreign direct investment the compulsory transfer of technology, or when a country restricts the free flow of data or the free flow of establishment of internet companies, or when a country subsidizes an industrial sector to generate a world problem of overproduction in the world, etc. So there are many definitions of protectionism there. And it's true that when the United States says that, it's basically talking about China. So, and what happens is when the WTO was formed in 1995, we all signed, the United States restricted the policy space for developing countries to do this. instruments, by the way, that not exactly the same, but some of these instruments the developed countries used to develop before their manufacturing in the industrial sector, so they were restricted. But China was not part there, so China had a lot of policy space, no, to use all of these instruments, and then signed access to WTO in 2001. And what happens in the world, why China went from 4% of manufacturing world production in the 90s to 25% of manufacturing world production in 1995. And exactly in the same proportion, the developed world dropped its participation in world manufacturing production, and it was much larger, the drop in manufacturing employment, which is a typically middle-class employment. So basically, when you talk about rule shaker, what do you mean, Diana, and what do you propose? Because still we have the problem, and we're not playing. You wrote an article about state-owned enterprises. So Alejandro, you laughed when Diana mentioned the thing about So we need a lot more transparency. What is admissible and what is not admissible? And not only in terms of trade policy, in terms of investment incentives. The world needs to have the discussion on investment subsidies. It's very important. So,
okay.
I have a book.
So there's behind you.
To write.
And then we'll go to Daniel. Yeah, I'll come to you in the back. I see you.
Thank you very much for your insights. And I just have a brief question. We've been talking a lot about the vacuum of leadership. And where is business leadership? And I would be interested in your thoughts, Douglas, Lippoldt, and others. What has happened to business in the DDA, and what are mechanisms to try to get business excited about the future of the global trade order? Thank you.
Daniel?
Thank you. I want to address both extremes of the...
Could you introduce yourself?
I'm sorry. My name is Daniel Crosby, and I'm a partner with the law firm of King & Spalding based in Geneva, Switzerland. Yes. And I wanted to talk to both ends of the panel, both Diana's trade rule shaking, and Carlos's suggestion that the WTO is a neoliberal political or economic order. And just to think through what USTR, what Lighthizer has said, that he would like to agree with you that it should be a very, very open, as much free trade as possible organization. That is not what we have, far from it. And that the WTO and the rules weren't made for China. So what do you do? In the same kind of line of questions, but if you take him and that regime at their word, which, whatever, you have to address that question, and it's the same that's going around. But your suggestion that the WTO is somehow a liberal or organization, maybe it was meant to be or could be, but the suggestion that it's certainly not, I think, is well-founded, and it's more of an exception-related organization than a rules-related organization, according to them. So when you bring in China, it shakes up the rules partly because of the way it addresses things like transparency, rule of law, other things. Then that causes a tension, and how we resolve that is an interesting one. But how do you cut through both of those issues, and particularly to observe, and I'll stop, that these guys come from the Reagan administration, when the big problem was the perception that Japan was benefiting from the system and not letting others participate in its system. And there's a very serious parallel to what we have, particularly in the new economy, where everything's blocked. You know, Alibaba can do everything anywhere it wants, but these companies can't participate in China. And I think that is rule shaking as well, in the same way that these guys were thinking the last time they were in their seats in the government.
Okay, one last question there in the back. The gentleman who was waving his hand. If we can get a microphone to him. In the back. No, in the back. Behind you. That was a great circle route. Can you speak into the microphone?
It worked. Now it's on. So it took the microphone about 2 minutes to get to me. But anyway. My name is Félix Sandoval, and I'm from ICTSD. My question is part of the title of the session. My assumption would be that if we're talking about the future of the global trade order, first of all, nobody would have the answer. Second, there will be many components to any possible answer. And if I were to try to find at least one component, would be Asia, the rise of Asia. That was not there 20 or 30 years ago, and certainly was not there when the GATT was created. And I guess my question is, how far does the system need to go as to embrace this new part of its spirit? Because the embodied spirit of the global trade order is a primarily Western spirit, and the world has changed, and the trade order as we know it today hasn't changed that much really, and I guess that would be one component that may assist us in trying to understand how it may look in the future.
Okay, so I think we've got a bunch of questions which kind of relate around the same theme, which is the rule taker, shaker, maker kind of constellation. Yeah? No, there's lots of questions, but I think there's a commonality there in terms of the question. So the nice thing about having this room for the next session, which is the launch, which is an open event, we can actually go over time, so we're not particularly constrained. So let's just go down the panel in terms of responding to both questions that were addressed to you, but anything else you want to react to as well. So Diana.
Well, I'll address some of the questions. Some were very unfair, Beatrino Fall. They require a book, but I'll link it up to some of the questions that were also addressed. And to one of the points that Simon made, and then on China. We've sat on commissions trying to save the WTO. The WTO apparently has saved itself without listening to us, so the WTO is in good shape, going back to my first point. Well, maybe not in good shape, in better shape than we see it. The question of it can save itself, to put it in other words. If the status quo is acceptable or not acceptable is a point is a judgment, it's a value judgment. I mean, it's acceptable for some countries, it's acceptable for some sectors, it's unacceptable for other countries, it's unacceptable for other sectors. It's a sector, it's a country, it's an issue-specific point. China, of course, is the big game changer, the rule shaker in the world. And I think there will be changes. How it's going to move, I don't know. But I think we have to begin thinking not only in terms of the way China has grown in the last 20 years, but what China wants of the system itself. And I think at the core of what China, we'll have to listen to China first, but at the core of what China is trying to make acceptable is something the WTO did away with, or did away partially and very strong, or rather try to do away very strongly with state, what are they called, state enterprises. They have a different SOEs. What does it say? State-owned enterprises. Yes, state-owned enterprises. I think that is probably the most important issue that affects China and the WTO, because these are state-owned enterprises that do not work in market terms, but still they are in the market, they export. I mean, this has to do with Beatrice's point. I think that is one of the issues that we'll have to come to terms with and see how we organize it, sort of how we debate, how we accept, don't accept these issues. But again, this is a political point, it's not a technical point. It's going to be a political point with a lot of technical research done for it. I mean, there's all these commissions that can go on working, of course. But I mean, it's going to end up being a political, sort of a political bargain. And here's where I don't see such a disagreement with Trump. I mean, Trump is not, of course, sort of favoring the state-owned enterprises, but is returning to a sort of more sovereign look on trade. And in that respect, I mean, there will be some kind of agreement between China and the United States if Trump remains in government, of course. I mean, that is another issue. The question of discrimination, I think, I'm not sure it has to do with, it has to do with recession, but it also has to do with surplus capacity. Surplus capacity forces countries to do things that they would not otherwise want to do, but they have to do it. I mean, there's a question of employment, there's a question of national sort of issues and stability, and as we've seen in Argentina so often. So it's not a question just of recession, but it has to do with maintaining domestic governance. I mean, that brings discrimination. But there's also a lot of discrimination, and this is a point that I've made so strongly so often, is it's a lot of discrimination that is inbuilt into the system in the way the sectors are governed. I mean, anti-dumping is discriminatory from the very beginning. I think I should stop, no?
No, you can keep on going.
Well, I will stop. No, I will stop.
No.
Otherwise I can... No, I will stop.
Okay.
This is all I have.
Just go down. So, Félix, you want to...
Yeah? Oh, very well. No, I want to make a reference to what
G20.
has been said by Beatriz Nofal that I mentioned yesterday. And that was before I heard this morning Susana Malcorra about her experience yesterday in a meeting of the ministers. And she observed that it's necessary to talk a lot, particularly with respect to the future of the multilateral trade system. So what I proposed yesterday, and I think could be a good idea, I don't know, is that the Troika, not the presidencies of Argentina, the Troika could ask the T20 and the B20 to make concrete suggestions and proposals of how to improve the multilateral global trade system. It was in the same line, and I mentioned yesterday, that the proposal that, according to the newspaper, had been raised by Cecilia Malmström, in the sense that ask to the United States what you propose, what you think it should be necessary to modify in the, for example, in the principle of non-discrimination. There is an option, there is an alternative. Which are your proposals? In terms of settlement of dispute, which are the proposals? In terms of discussion about market economy, which are your proposals? But everyone must make proposals about how to improve the system. If not, is in some way esoteric discussion or a geopolitical discussion and not a real discussion.
Can I just say that we also ask the Women 20 include that?
No, we'll come, yeah, so I have a list of the questions, so I'll get back to them if they don't answer. So, Doug.
Right. Okay. Well, on the question about G20, I mean, I actually have a published view on this, and I'm thinking that we have Minister Malcorra chairing this session. She's in a strategic position to help guide conclusions, and she's made several statements leading up to the ministerial that she hopes to launch a process. She doesn't expect to have the process will not end with what does or doesn't happen in the next day. And with Argentina chairing or having the presidency of the G20, it's in a particularly good position, I think, to follow up going forward. So I absolutely agree with this, and I published a little piece exactly on this point. I think that continuity, it's a unique alignment that's arrived here. We should capitalize on it. And that leads me to Isa's point, asking about how business can show leadership. And I mean, I think business is a little bit shy to get out in front of the electorate or to take a public stand that might contradict or be misinterpreted in a public space. But there is the B20. I'm Deputy Dog or Deputy Doug. I'm junior delegate in the Trade and Investment Task Force. I mean, businesses are engaged, and they have been saying to G20 leaders repeatedly in the last 4 or 5 G20 presidencies that I've been involved with, that this rise in protectionism needs to be checked. We need to develop a positive agenda for trade, and we've made concrete suggestions. There's B20 Trade and Investment Task Force reports every year that are including the element of the digital economy that was raised here as well. So there's the materials there and businesses voicing it. I think what's missing in this picture of business being able to communicate is in the ILO we have a tripartite structure. Business and labor are represented as well as governments. In OECD we've got state-to-state structure, state intergovernmental organization, but attached to it is the Business Industry Advisory Committee and the Trade Union Advisory Committee. You've got these structures that are built in to the OECD Secretariat that assure that business and labor views are collected and articulated via duly appointed representatives from these groups in some of the OECD leadership bodies anyhow. So I think where I'm going with this, I'm thinking that perhaps in the WTO structure, it's time to be considering a mechanism to ensure that business and labor has a voice. It doesn't have to be as a member; it can be a consultative voice. But I think there should be a means of collecting these views and making sure that they're taken into account. And right now it's done in an ad hoc manner. The WTO has become much more open and transparent and consultative. It's great, but I think it needs this formal structure. I guess the other thing, Simon's question about what's the trigger for change, I certainly hope that it's not misbehavior by a leading member or exiting from the organization by a leading member. I'd rather have a positive coalition going forward. Maybe this is something that the TPP members can do, is to come together and propose an agenda to multilateralize some of the innovations that are embedded in this agreement. Or maybe it's via the RCEP, if they can include that in the coming year. Maybe it's via that group. But so I'd rather have a positive agenda here than wait until the negative act happens and catalyzes a dramatic need for some response. I'd rather have a considered way forward. And on you asking, Alan Wolf had the opposite advice from what Félix had recommended, which is to ask the Americans what they want. In Alan Wolf's statement at the American University in October, his recommendation was, don't wait for the Americans to tell you what they want. Proceed, and you can be sure that they will speak up and tell you what they want if you begin to proceed in a way that's unsuited to their interest. So I thought that was an interesting approach he was proposing. Okay. So with that, thank you.
Thanks. Andreas?
Yeah, business keeps a low profile, and I think there might be good reason for at this point, at least from their perspective. We did 2 surveys in Germany, one in 2014, one in 2016, asking people, what do you think about increasing participation in global trade from a German perspective, and it plunged from almost 90% to 56%, that people are in favor of increased trade. And that's not the environment where you where you raise your voice, because that is no winning theme. And I think as long as we don't dig deeper and better understanding the reason for this kind of resentment or this kind of Widerstand, I don't know the word, opposition to global trade, it won't get better. We have this author Dawn Hansen study. A similar thing has been done in Germany recently by Südicom, and what came out is that the regions which strong exposition to the major shock in global trade, which is the rise of production from China, 20%, these regions go 2 ways. Either they really suffer badly with employment losses up to 40%, or they use the opportunities of a new market and gain. The result is ever more departing society, and I think business is not yet in a position, or has not put itself into a position to give answers to that question. And if you look at the German election results, which really cause us problems now, they fit exactly into that pattern. Exactly there where the exposition to that kind of trade losses is high, you have the extremist vote. This is not just B20, but a big societal task to deal with.
Great, thank you. Carlos.
Well, I'm the last thing between you and the books and the cocktail. But,
that was quick.
Now Alejandro woke up. But I have 4 things related to G20, business, and the WTO. Is there a crisis? Because I think I would like to respond to some of the points that were made. And finally, the question from Simon in terms of what would move the system from complacency. So actually let me start with this question of Simon. I think it's happening. I think that China is part of this shock because, as was pointed out, it's a different world. Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about China, and this was a question that Dan Crosby raised, there are many issues, particularly the role of state-owned enterprise. Now, China is quite willing to play the game in multilateral institutions. For my sins, I was the person in charge of negotiating the increase of the capital of the World Bank Group in 2010. And I can tell you, if it were not for China's flexibility, it would not have happened. So China, when it is in its own interest, can play this game. At the same time, in the context of the WTO, China still plays the game of a recently acceded member, and it's not willing to play the role of leader in the sense of looking not only in terms of its own national interests, but also in terms of this global public good that the multilateral rules of the game provide to all of us. Will it play this game? I don't know. I'm not very optimistic with respect to this. With respect to the business, well, let me just recognize the cocktail that you are going to have in a moment has been provided by Philip Morris International. Thank you very much. Also the support for this book. So the business, the private sector is involved. But I always remember 5 years ago during one of the IND CEO sessions, I asked CEOs, what word comes to your mind when I say WTO? And these are CEOs, I made a quick count, $1 trillion in the room in terms of capitalization of large companies like Caterpillar, UBS, etc. And the answer that came was very interesting. Several came with the word frustration. Okay? It's not that they think that the WTO is irrelevant, very far from that. But there is frustration because of velocity, because of the agenda, and because of some issues that simply are not in the agenda at this point in time. So this takes me to the G20. Can the G20 help? Yes, definitely. Actually, I would even recommend just look at the recommendations going back, for instance, to the Korean leadership in the G20 when I was still sous Sherpa for the World Bank, going over the years. And then ask yourself also, when you move from a country to another, do the priorities are the same? Are Argentinian priorities for the G20 at least similar to the Russian priorities? I would not answer, but just take a look, okay? But yes, the G20 has an important role to play, but I can tell you, I was the executive secretary of the development committee of the World Bank and the IMF. So I knew that the Doha round was dead when we could not put in the declaration of the development community anymore one paragraph saying, and we look forward to a prompt finalization of the negotiations of the Doha round. This is 2010. Things happened since then. So we had Bali, the trade facilitation agreement, and I always say it's a little bit like when I die and Alejandro Jara comes to say my eulogy. What I would like to hear is, look, he's moving. In reality, that's more or less the situation today with respect to the WTO. And this leads me to the question of, is there a crisis? Well, it all depends on how you define it. My chapter is called The Threat of Economic Disintegration, ? Okay? Is there a threat? Yes, there is a threat. So if we go to all the functions that the WTO fulfills, several of them nowadays are under threat. And just to think about it, I guess, just go and read Ernest Hemingway. There is one book where one character goes bankrupt. And people ask, how did you go bankrupt? And he says, well, first very slowly, and then all of a sudden. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot. So for those of you who came expecting answers, of course you don't get the answers. You get the book, you can reflect on the book. I would just have one thing on Simon's question with respect to the trigger. I guess the book is more exciting. So let's stop this session here. Thanks a lot for everyone.
Please.
No, so I think on the trigger question, so I think one of the things that I see happening in Europe is, especially once the Brits are gone, Europe is going to become much more transactional a la Trump, and I think we're going to see a lot more proactive, kind of more old-fashioned uses of trade policy. And I think one of the triggers that I see lurking on the horizon is tax, right? So I think we're heading for a huge fight on corporate taxation, and I think that is going to be something which is going to really concentrate the mind, because that is big money. So let's stop there. Thanks a lot to everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah, no.